Emma Underwood, I can't wait for this, discussing supporting older people with LGBT in care. So please take it away.
Fab, thank you so much, Adam. I think because there's only a couple of us here, what we might do is have it as more of a conversation, if that's okay, and just almost kind of do it like an interview or like a podcast or however you might want to do it. I've got some slides, so we've got a little bit of structure that we can go through, some of which might be relevant, some of which might not be, but we'll kind of pick and choose because I think we've got the capacity to do that, if that's all right. Right. Hello, everybody. Hello, listeners. Hello, everybody who's tuning in at a future date. Welcome to Understanding the Needs of Older LGBTQ+ people. This initially is supposed to be an hour-long presentation with a few interactive bits, but I think what we will, as we sort of said at the start, what we will do is make it a bit more conversational than it otherwise would have been, using the kind of later slides to have a bit of a structure around what we talk about. So my name is Emma Underwood, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm the training officer at Opening Doors. It's a job title that does what it says on the tin, like create and deliver training mainly for healthcare, social care and housing sector organisations. I primarily come from a background of community organising and social activism. I have a speciality in trans legislative reform. So if you were clued in on any of the stuff that's been happening over the last few years, whether it was the Gender Recognition Act reform or the Bell versus Tavistock case study, that was me squirreling away behind the scenes. But I do have some experience in health and social care as well. I was part of setting up Indigo Gender Service, which is the first trans-led healthcare, transition-related healthcare service in the UK. And I at least bring some of that idea of kind of change-making to the training that I deliver, because I think when we talk about awareness, and a lot of the time, some people come to me asking for LGBT awareness training. I think it's great, and I think people do need to be more aware of the things that are going on. But I think generally people are aware of LGBTQ+ people at this point, but what they don't know is what to do about that fact and how to provide better services for them. And it's that action that I really want to take forward into a lot of the work that we do. So that's kind of going to be the focus of today's session. So with that in mind, then, we're going to do a few introductions, a few ground rules. This will be very, very quick because there's only a handful of us. We're then going to move on to setting the scene a little bit. We're going to have a look at some core identities and what they mean and how do we identify them. But also looking at a bit at history, a bit at the law, a bit at kind of why we're here. Then we're going to move on to specific health and social care needs. We're going to break down lots of different topics about the specific needs of older LGBTQ+ people. And we'll sum it all up nicely for you at the end there. So as with that introduction, these don't necessarily apply massively, but please keep yourself muted unless you're speaking. There's only 3 of us here, so it's not too much of a problem. That's fine. In fact, I would actively dissuade you from doing this, because otherwise I'm going to be talking to myself for the whole time. That's no fun. Every question is welcome. Again, this is sort of a polite way of saying that there are no stupid questions. I can assure you that this is a learning space, and any language that you feel most comfortable using is absolutely fine. I will take it as it is. You don't need to raise your hand, just ask, and that will be fine. We operate what we call a brave space policy. You might have come across the phrase safe space before. Similar sort of concept. We want to make sure that everybody in this space is feeling confident and comfortable and safe. We also acknowledge that a lot of the topics that we might be dealing with today can be quite challenging. So do just bear with us as we go through that. And finally, we will always assume best intent. We will assume that you are all here to learn and to listen, are coming here in good faith. And we hope that you assume the same of us, that we are coming here in good faith as well, or me specifically rather than we. Few content warnings. We will probably be discussing homophobia, biphobia and transphobia, violence, both verbal and physical, historical mistreatment, mental health, mental illness and illness more broadly. So a quick note then on who we are. Opening Doors, we are actually the largest provider of direct services for older lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans people in the UK. And we aim to ensure that all older LGBTQ+ people live happy, healthy and independent lives that are free from loneliness, isolation, prejudice and discrimination. And I like to think that we managed to do that on a good day. We have our origins as a gay men's support group. And whilst we now deliver services to a much broader range of demographics than just gay men, we do maintain those roots of bringing communities together through social activities, support groups, that sort of thing. We also engage in larger scale events, including London Pride, which you can see our Pride bus there, as well as much smaller scale activities, which is where our befriending service comes in, where we match up an older LGBTQ+ person with a younger volunteer. That volunteer will then go into that older person's home or local neighbourhood in an effort to spend time one-on-one with them and decrease social isolation. We are often called upon to consult on policy on both a local and national level. And we're able to do this in no small part thanks to our wonderful research team, who make sure that we are really on the cutting edge when it comes to information about older LGBTQ+ people. A lot of that research then involves training, which is where I come in, which we usually deliver to healthcare, social care and housing sector organisations, as well as our Pride in Care quality standard, which helps hold your hand through the process of ensuring that your organisation is absolutely as inclusive as it can be. So I'm going to go straight into the first meaty part of our content today, setting the scene. When I am asked to come and deliver training like this, or rather when I tell people what I do, or when I offer this training to people, some of the responses that I get sometimes are something along the lines of, well, why? Why do I have to come and sit through an hour and a half, 3 hours, whatever it might be, on training for older LGBTQ+ people? I just treat everybody equally. I treat everybody the same. And generally, that's a pretty good way of going about life. But when it comes to providing services for people and providing care for people, that's not always the best way of going about things. So I've got a nice little diagram here that kind of helps to illustrate that a little bit. So we start off over here with inequality, right? We've got two people, both of whom are trying to access services or resources. We can see that they're both unevenly distributed and neither of them can actively engage with those resources. They have to wait for them to come to them. So that's when we start treating people with equality, right? Exactly the same. We give people evenly distributed tools and assistance. Well, great. Now this person can reach those resources and access those services, but this person can't, despite being treated with equality. So that's why we have to treat people with equity, right? We treat people according to their needs. We give them custom tools that address that inequality specifically. So now, great, they can both access those resources. We still have the problem that they are unevenly distributed. So that's where justice comes in, right? Justice is where we fix the system, we redistribute those resources and services, and it's at that point that we can start treating people with true equality. Usually when we come and talk to organisations, they're somewhere around this marker here. We hope to get people to at least this point, and if you stick with us for kind of several runs of training and our quality standard, even up into this bit over here. So I'm going to come out of my screen share for this actually, because I think this is a good kind of conversation point. Jade and Adam, I've got you both on the screen, so I hope you don't mind me using you as conversation pieces. Could you both confidently give me definitions for the whole LGBTQ+ acronym?
I feel like I'm a cheater, so I'm going to let Jade go first.
So, lesbian, bisexual, trans, gay, I've got that in the wrong order, questioning, intersex, asexual, and then there's lots more. They're the ones that come to mind when I think of the acronym.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to say you've got them all right. I would add queer with questioning. Yeah. I think it's a reclaimed slur that I cherish using. I love using the word queer. I think it's a fantastic word. And then obviously we've got a pantheon of other labels, and you know, we can talk about pansexuality, we can talk about all sorts of different things. But yeah, no, the LGBTQIA side of things is, and that's why the plus is there. You know, we can't list all those letters out. I sometimes worry that they want to be inclusive to represent everybody within the LGBTQIA+ community in itself creates animosity, because then it's, oh, we've got a longer term that we need to use, and then that sort of gives people this ammunition to go, oh gosh, how many more are there now? Because there's still that in society that aren't understanding that actually we're not closed to binary genders now. You know, there is more out there than just male and female, and I think it's a shame, and I'd hate to put anyone into the closet, but I worry that we need to educate society more. And I don't know what you think, Emma.
I think it's a really, I think I can see both sides. I think honestly, if somebody is going to be bigoted and hate us, they will find whatever reason they want to, and the length of our acronym is not going to change that. But I've said this on other trainings that I've done, if I had to give a single prediction for the way that our community is going to change over the next 10 years, I think we're going to drop the acronym and move to something. Maybe it's queer that we will just use as a community label, because I see that quite regularly. But it's an interesting point that you bring up about that word. And for those listening who aren't aware, the word queer has its origins as a word that has been used to berate us, to degrade us, to cause direct harm to our community. And there are some people that find real power in reclaiming that term, and I do it sometimes as well. But when we look at communities over the age of 50, they are more likely to experience direct violence in relation to that word. And so when we're engaging with those communities, we have to be really especially careful about our language choices, because the words that we might feel comfortable using are not universally comfortable for everybody. And I have similar issues with other words that are being attempted to be reclaimed. I know that the F slur is being reclaimed in some areas. Now that makes me deeply, deeply uncomfortable, because
That's a difficult one. And I will say that I think the F slur is more of a kink than a reclaim. I think within the sexual communities and the different orientational communities, I think the F slur is a sort of dominance and a sort of kink term, which I find odd. I find almost self-deprecating, which is a shame. But then again, people, like you say, will find queer the same way. So it's trying to understand it from a holistic view, isn't it?
Exactly. I think the general kind of advice that I would give to people is, unless somebody has given you explicit consent to use that word to describe themselves, it's probably best to just stay away. It's one thing for somebody to say, actually, I'm fine with using this word, and I'm fine with you using that word on me. It's a whole other scenario if you use that word and it has triggered a part of their trauma, or has brought something back to them that is deeply, deeply uncomfortable for them. So I think it's worth having that caution around some of the terminology that we use. But one of the other things that I kind of bring up is we've kind of just spoken about some of the most common words that the community is using today to describe themselves. But these aren't always the words that have been used. And I get people sometimes saying, because it's mainly, to be honest, around the word transsexual. And I get people sometimes sort of saying, well, isn't that really offensive? Isn't that a really kind of derogatory word to use for people? And some people can see it as that. Some people can see it as a derogatory word. But for trans people who maybe came out in the 1970s and the 1980s, that was the word that they came to understand to describe themselves best. And I wonder, so I'll out myself now, I am a transgender woman. I wonder if in 75 years' time, when I'm 100, provided I live that long, it's a bit of a broad guess. Is that the word that people will still use to describe the identity that I feel comfortable with? Will people see the word that I use as outdated or offensive?
No, it's a really interesting point, and I have my conversation because me and my partner have been together, oh gosh, 13 years this year, I think it's, which, and it's a long time. I'm 33, so I've been with him since I'm 21. And we have completely polarizing views. So I love Pride. I think it's fantastic. I love celebrating our history and educating the younger generations as to it's not a drinking opportunity, it's a celebration opportunity. But I'm also a massive Trekkie at heart. So my other half can't understand labels and doesn't want to be labeled to anything, doesn't feel like he needs to come out in any scenario because he is just who he is. And I agree with that. So I would hope in 75 years' time, we've got to a part in society when actually we don't care about gender and race and sex. And actually we are just people and enjoy people as being people. You never know, we may be interspecies with alien cultures by then. But it's that idea of just being able to accept and love everybody without having to feel like we need to be labeled in it. But I understand that the need to have that label, the need to have that identity is, as a society, especially during Thatcher and all of that, we have been forced closeted. So we've not been able to have that identity and be part of society and own who we are. I just hope that the education of society moves forward, and that we don't require those labels in the future, if you know what I mean. That's just my personal opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's safety in numbers, right, and safety in community, and that is what LGBTQ plus people have needed for the longest time. And at the moment, we still need that. We still need that safety in finding others who are like us. And it's for many parts of our community, it's gotten a lot better. For some parts of our community, it's gotten a lot worse over the last few years. And so I would also hope that we at least move to a point where we don't feel like we have to be in those labels and be in that community for safety reasons, but rather for chosen family reasons, for celebratory reasons, for joy, because we enjoy being around people who are like ourselves. And that's a really exciting prospect for me, is that that's the point that we will get to. Fab. All right, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to move us on to the next bit. So I'm going to share my screen again. Oh, welcome, Michelle. Don't worry about camera, that's absolutely fine. Because there's only a handful of us, what we're doing is we are kind of using the presentation that I would have given as a kind of jumping off point, so that we can just have a bit of a conversation and we can kind of guide it around what you're all interested in. It's worth talking, I think, a bit about history, because I think it's, you know, for a variety of reasons, it's not taught in schools, and there is a bit of a generational gap between those who understand history and those who don't. And when we lose that history, we lose the context in which people live their lives. And so when we're looking at older LGBTQ plus people, we do need to acknowledge the fact that they may have lived very different lives from their heterosexual or cisgender peers, or even their LGBTQ plus peers of a younger age. So I've broken it down into three kind of key areas that I think is relevant for us to consider. First element is the law, right? We know that up until 1967, committing homosexual acts was illegal in England and Wales. It wasn't until 1982 that came into effect in Scotland and St. Kitts, so even later for that part of the country. This was a kind of end point of centuries of criminalization and penalization by the state of our communities. We also saw trans people punished under another law called the Vagrancy Act, a law which linked trans expressions, trans identities, trans feminine expressions more specifically, with soliciting sex, so with sex work, and by that reason then were also incarcerated. Now, the Vagrancy Act is still in place today. It never got repealed. Now, today it is used to primarily punish homeless people and sex workers. I am, after all, not delivering this training from behind prison bars. It's not been used to punish a trans person for a while. But knowing that those laws are still very much in place for many parts of our community is a deeply, deeply worrying thought. Alongside that, then, we had the press and the media ensuring that the UK was an actively hostile place for LGBTQ plus people to grow up and to live in. We had tabloid press outing people. We had them running humiliation and naming and shaming campaigns. If you had any form of minor celebrity, if you lived in a rural area, it's why many people had to flee their rural homes to seek the relative safety of the anonymity that the city provided, which is why you see much higher concentrations of LGBTQ plus people in places like London, Manchester, Brighton, because people fled there for safety. So we had this kind of pairing of making it incredibly hostile for LGBTQ plus people to live. And then finally, unfortunately, and I think this is the one that surprises people the most, especially when I come and deliver this training to health and social care services, is that sector had an enormous hand in facilitating the oppression of those communities. It wasn't that long ago, it was only in the 1980s that we stopped offering conversion therapy, or aversion therapy, sorry, on the NHS, right? A process by which an LGBTQ plus person was shown semi-naked pictures of somebody of the same sex or gender, and then would be electrocuted or given nausea-inducing pills in order to create the association between pain or discomfort and their attraction to other people. Now, that might have stopped in the 1980s, but conversion therapy is unfortunately very much alive and well. The government, as you might be aware, have been in conversation about banning it for a fair number of years now, and came to the conclusion only a couple of weeks ago that it would be banning it for lesbian, gay and bi people, but not for trans people. Because apparently state-sanctioned torture is fine for one demographic, but not for the others. So we have that element of the health and social care sector. But we also have the aspect of transition-related healthcare, a process which, for its entirety, has relied on the process of what we call gatekeeping, right? Which is by the process by which a person outside of our community sets the rules that somebody has to jump through in order to access those services. So trans people for decades have had to undergo humiliating, degrading, and downright horrible aspects of the medical system in order to be given access to trans-related healthcare. There are even reports of one doctor's criteria in the early 1990s and late 1980s saying that in order to medically transition, a trans person would have to be considered attractive in their chosen gender, which is disgusting. You can go back and read that specific doctor's journals and read about how he fantasized about his patients. This is the kind of environment that older LGBTQ plus people, if they didn't grow up during this period, they will or experience it directly, they would at the very least have known it was happening. And then, of course, we had the HIV/AIDS crisis of the 80s and 90s, a pandemic which was unfortunately incredibly mismanaged, both by the government, but unfortunately by medical staff as well. I'm going to come out of screen share a second. Hello, Michelle, welcome. And I guess a question to kind of all of you. I mean, I know, Adam, you sort of said that you're part of the community, but the history of this stuff, do you think that it's something that a lot of people are aware of?
I think for me, I think there's so much around the LGBTQIA plus history that people don't understand. So, like you were saying about the illegality of homosexual acts, never applied to lesbians.
No.
You know, there's never been a law in place to prevent lesbians, and there's not even an age of consent for lesbians to interact sexually. You know, a lot of the persecution has, and in fact, if you look back at, say, old movies, old films, and even some old silent films, you can clearly see lesbianism portrayed within those films, because it was commonplace in places for women to be living their lives out together as companions. It's the male side of things that I have always found quite difficult. For me, the hardest parts have been, say, Section 28 and the awful Thatcher rule, which didn't end until the early 2000s, I think it was, wasn't it? Which was just horrendous. And one thing I've always thought about and try to educate people on, because they'll always praise how wonderful health and social care is, and it's fantastic, but it wasn't until 2 years ago that I could go and give blood without having to be celibate for 3 months. You know, it's changed now, but up until a couple of years ago, we had to be celibate. I think it was either 3 or 6 months before we went and gave blood, because there was still that stigma, that propaganda around gay and bisexual men spreading HIV. We're seeing it now with the monkeypox virus. You know, the first headline I've seen about it, most prominent in gay and bisexual men. How is my orientation making me more susceptible to this virus? And what we do is we tend to go to the orientation rather than the environment first. And that's the problem we've got, and that's the problem we still stick with in the media. It's the problem we still stick with in government. It's the reason why we won't ban conversion therapy. And not to be crude, I also think a lot of the problems in the historical law and approach to LGBTQ care and, you know, and support has been our prudishness around sex. We are a prudish society. We are a prudish country. And because we have all of these ideals about sex, that informs how we approach things. Because we have been based on a Christian religion and quite heavily involved within our government, and our royal family are still head of state, and our churchgoers, that prudishness does feed into the approach of society around the LGBT culture. And I just think there's so much that needs to be done, and I don't think people know enough about what. I mean, Russell T Davies was amazing. It's a Sin, fantastic. Cucumber, brilliant. Queer as Folk was my awakening when I was like 9 years old or whatever when it came out. Those things are great, but they tend to deal with the heavy hitting stuff, and it'd be just wonderful if we could educate people about Alan Turing without it being horrific. We want to be able to educate people and go, look, this is how far we've come and where we can go, instead of staying within that shame, because that damages us as well. You're not being able to shed that shame and that upset. So yeah, that's me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so many valid points in there. I think the history of kind of legal persecution has a really interesting kind of background to it. When we look at the kind of the first kind of official documented in law criminalization of LGBTQ plus identities is the Buggery Act in 1533 by Henry VIII, right? Which specifically actually criminalized anal sex. Didn't matter who it was that was engaging in it. It was across the board. And the reason that it was introduced was not necessarily, well, obviously had obviously its homophobic, biphobic, transphobic undertones, but it was part of Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, so that he had extra legislation in hand to say, well, all of these monks are sleeping together, and to go in and do that. And whilst we don't see kind of the similar examples for lesbian and bi women, we do see examples of we only have to look back to the 1970s when if a woman was in a relationship with a man, had children, and then got divorced from that man in order to pursue a relationship with another woman, her children would be taken away from her because she would be deemed an unfit mother, because there were inherent links between being a lesbian and it being inherently violent. So it's despite these things not kind of being enshrined in law, that persecution is very, very much still present. But you're absolutely right, and I think when it comes to representation and kind of portrayals of LGBTQ plus identities, what I'm kind of I'm quite sad about this. What we only really see is unfortunately we only really see gay men. That's the primary form of representation that our community gets. The three or rather the three if you've ever seen I think it's Munro Bergdorf that did the documentary on trans representation in media. The three archetypes that trans people fell into in media portrayal is the victim, so somebody who has been murdered, the murderer, as in Buffalo Bill or in Psycho, or the somebody to be pitied, right? Somebody who is a farce. And we don't see positive representations in any kind of central leading role, even in It's a Sin, and I loved It's a Sin. But the fact that it had no mention of trans people in it whatsoever, despite the fact that trans women and trans feminine people were also caught up in the same circles that gay and bi men were in, and so were also being victimized by that disease. We don't see that talked about anywhere at the moment. So it is kind of, we still have such a long way to go before we see any kind of true representation. Jade and Michelle, is that kind of something that you echo? Have you seen kind of good areas of representation or bad areas of representation?
I just have to say that I've seen Heartstopper recently, and I think that is a good way forward in bringing everybody together, and nothing like that's been on the screen sort of ever. So I really enjoyed watching that.
I've heard excellent things. It is on my to watch list, but I haven't got around to it yet. I
believe the books actually progress the story, and you get more of a background of all the characters as well. So I'd probably recommend reading the books. I may even go and read them myself now, because it carries on beyond the series that's been televised.
Oh, fun. I love a good book show tie-in. I think it's a great way of adapting.
Yeah, that's on my to-do. or to watch list as well, quickly before my Netflix cancellation kicks in. Oh gosh, I've got 4 days. Oh dear, I think back on in autumn. No, for me, I mean, I'm probably looking at you all. I'm guessing that I'm maybe of a slightly older vintage. So I was marching when Section 28 came in. So I do know some of that history. I mean, for me, why I kind of joined this group was really because my last job was managing a nursing home, and I think sexuality in general is lousily kind of supported in that kind of setting. But any sexuality that's sort of outside, you know, what's still seen as the norm in my tiny little area of Northwest Wales is, you know, barely spoken of. Although lesbian women, actually, we probably had more conversation about that, but that was simply because of the makeup of our staff team. So it's kind of by chance rather than anything else. So I just think we need to get better at supporting people and being mindful of the fact that maybe someone of 90 is really not going to be so open because of all that history, and because they've lived in, you know, an area where they will have had to be very coy, potentially. So, you know, so that's kind of my interest really. So I didn't answer your question, but you know, I thought I'd just chat.
It's a useful insight, and I having been born and grown up for 18 years in Pembrokeshire, in rural, yes, I empathise. But you're right in the sense that this history of discrimination and persecution creates mistrust in communities, and that is especially felt by older LGBTQ+ people who will have grown up knowing that aversion therapy was happening, knowing how the HIV/AIDS crisis was being undertaken, knowing how this transition-related healthcare was being done. All of this stuff creates an environment where people feel uncomfortable, and it's up to you, and I say that as a general you, to help break down those walls and make it easier for people to be comfortable being themselves. One of the kind of saddest things that I've come across whilst doing this job is people who have told me that they've had to go back into the closet when they go into residential care or receive care as an older adult, because I think there was one person that told me, well, I just don't trust anybody in a uniform, because anybody who is part of any kind of authority figure is part of that persecution, is part of that hatred. So it's on us. So let's talk about a few of those kind of direct needs. I think I'm going to not go back into sharing my screen. I'm just going to keep us here where we are. Oh, I will actually. No, I will, because there's a video that I want to show you in just a moment. Yeah, so let's have a chat about some of these specific health and social care needs. What we're talking about here, really, and ultimately, is person-centered care. It's as simple as that. And sometimes that is a kind of light bulb moment for some people. For others, it's kind of, well, yeah, obviously. But I think for those of us, especially who have experience of having our identities either overlooked or just not considered at all, or at least not asked about, we kind of feel this idea that actually sometimes we do have specific needs, and older LGBTQ+ people will have specific needs that relate to their identity that often isn't talked about so much. So, okay, why are there some of these additional healthcare needs then? Well, older LGBTQ+ people are twice as likely as heterosexual or cisgender people to rely on health, housing and social care services. Cis, for those of you who are watching who aren't aware, is the word that we use to describe somebody who isn't trans. But most older LGBTQ+ people also say that they still lack confidence in those very same services because of that poor treatment in the past. I'm going to show you this brief video now on the importance of that inclusion. We're going to go back to the start.
It's interesting around statistics. Some of the people we talk to, particularly people around care, will say we don't have any people who are LGBT. That's often because they don't ask the question systematically that they might do around ethnicity, for example. But also older LGBT people in particular tend not to self-identify because of bad experiences they've had in the past.
I never ever exposed my sexuality, and with my partner of all those years, We never ever discussed it.
There is a great need of older LGBT people to go into care, as there is with many older people, but there are some big differences between older LGBT people on the whole and their heterosexual peers. All the research is that older LGBT people tend not to have children, so they tend not to have grandchildren. They are often estranged from family. So you have people who at this age don't have family support around them, but who come from a background of some trauma.
I knew I actually needed care some time ago, but it was difficult for me to accept that I needed care because I still consider myself to be a young man and I should be able to do all of the things I need to do myself.
One of the biggest fears that older LGBT people have when contemplating going into a care home of some kind is that they'll experience the same kind of hostility and prejudice, neglect, potentially even harassment, bullying, violence that they've experienced in the past.
My biggest fear about having residential care is that I will have to cease to be gay. I will have to go back into the closet. I would not be able to display photographs of myself and my partner. It's that fear because I come from the generation where my generation is still, I feel, quite homophobic. So if I'm living with people of my age or even older, they are still quite homophobic and they would not accept me as a gay man, let alone my partner who is half of my age. So that's a real concern for me.
If we can imagine the world of the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, even into the 1980s in the UK, was a very hostile climate if you were a young LGBT person.
So hopefully that video gives you a little bit of insight into some of the experiences that older LGBTQ plus people may have had, either as they grew up or going into care. So I'm going to come out of my screen share again, and we're going to go through just together. I think we'll just have a chat about it again as we were before. Some aspects that that maybe set older LGBTQ plus people apart from their heterosexual or cisgender counterparts. I'll throw it out to the three of you. Are there any specific care needs that you think an older LGBTQ plus person might have, or any areas that you think might be overlooked when caring for them?
I think it is more about those important relationships, isn't it? Our forms always ask for, you know, next of kin, and it's kind of automatically expect that to be a husband or a wife in the kind of old-fashioned sense where they were of a different gender, and also your family. And I think we need to be a bit broader about that, so that actually your next of kin can be whoever you want it to be.
Yeah.
And so that means that people don't have to disclose, because you're asking those questions as well when you first met people, which I'm not necessarily going to want to share. And I've not got any hang-ups, or any trauma in my past, but I'm not necessarily wanting to share all of that initially. So I think you ought to just be able to, we ought to maybe think about our kind of, certainly when people move in, how to enable people to feel included by asking just more general, open, and it all goes back to being person-centered, doesn't it? I mean, it just very much so, just so that people can disclose as much or as little about themselves, and that you can be sharing and getting support from the people that they want to be involved in their care, because for many of us, for many different reasons, that may not be our blood relatives.
Yeah, absolutely. You're so right there that that option to not disclose that information is incredibly important. And whilst we do want to try and collect that data wherever we can, because it helps us to build a better picture of an individual and what support they might need, it is always their right to say, I don't feel comfortable telling you that. And that is a universal experience. That's not one that is unique to older LGBTQ plus people, but it's worth considering that history when we are having those conversations. But also thinking about ways that we can ask open-ended questions. So one of the ways that I quite like to do things is, rather than kind of asking, if you're just having a conversation with somebody, rather than asking, please tell me your sexual orientation and your gender identity, is asking questions like, oh, what words best describe you when you think about attraction, or when you think about your gender, and we had that conversation, Adam, we spoke earlier about labels, and that opens it up to people who don't want to put themselves in labels either. You know, they have that freedom to say, oh, well, I experience attraction, you know, primarily to men, but also to women sometimes as well, sometimes to non-binary people. So it gives that kind of open-ended aspect as well. But one of the things that we see fairly common is either those questions aren't asked, right? They're not, sexual orientation, gender identity, trans status isn't asked, or they're asked in a way that doesn't make sense. And sometimes that can be even worse. And I remember very specifically how many times I've come across a form that has got gender, you know, choose your gender here, and it gives me the option of male, female, transgender, and I think, well, how do I answer that question accurately? What do I put forward there as my answer? Because I'm a woman, but I'm also a trans woman. I'm having to choose then between what I think is most important for them to know about me. And 9 times out of 10, it's more important for them to know that I'm a woman than I am trans. But that then leads to difficult conversations later down the line, when I have to sort of tell them, no, I promise you I don't need a smear test because of X, Y, and Z. So it's yeah, most forms just say male or female, absolutely, and that is a very reductive way at looking at things. Oh, Adam, yeah. Come on.
There's just so much to. I was getting quite emotional watching that, actually, just thinking how you're able to live your life in private how you want to, even though it's probably not the best situation, and then you're still fearing it in your twilight years, not being able to be the person you want to be. For me, there's definitely something around AWOC, so aging without children. There's that social aspect of things. There's advocacy in care. So as much as, you know, the chaps in that video might have had that capacity there, and then all it takes is a stroke, and all of a sudden they don't have the capacity to manage their own care needs, and then there's that advocacy need. That's great. And then it's the fear of, will the advocacy really fight for my rights? Will they believe and be passionate about what's meaningful to me? And it's that concern that actually the bureaucracy of the higher ups and your third parties actually don't really care. They just want to make sure that you're in a state funded home, which is costing the state as little money as possible, and they're not bothered about whether you're being respected and dignified. I think mental health is a huge one, because of depression, isolation, loneliness invariably will lead to things like eating disorders and self-harm, and that ability to be able to control one's life. And I agree with Michelle, it's about asking those open-ended questions, but it's got to come from a culture that believes it.
Yeah.
It can't be tokenistic. So I would always meet with people and go, you know, my name's Adam, nice to meet you. I go by the pronouns he, him, and this is who I am. This is, you know, what I do in the organisation. And I will always remember 2 stories. I remember when I was younger, first got into care, I'd moved from one care job to another. I'd gone to the local Pride in Blackpool, and I'd come back to work, and I won't use the actual slur, but the F slur, and someone had come in and said, I believe one of your carers is gay. I don't want an F looking after my dad, and was literally banning me from looking after them. So all sorted. Years later, can you believe they now work in care and ask me for LGBT inclusive materials? I thought the irony of it. But then a few years ago, I went and did an assessment for someone's care needs to be supported at home, and this is where the barriers come. This is where the equality comes, because we want to make sure everyone's rights are respected as long as they don't infringe on other people's health and well-being. And I remember going to do this assessment, and the son said, by the way, we don't want no gays. We don't want no gays coming into this house and looking after my dad. And at that point, I said, well, just to let you know, I do go by the pronouns he, him, but I am a homosexual male and I manage the service. So if that's going to be an issue, let's move on from this, and I'll leave now and you can find another service. And it's trying to find that balance of respect. So yes, you can choose, if you need to, the gender of the person supporting you, but should it go as far as orientation? And in fact, should we still allow gender choice when providing support and care? Because if we do, we then come to barriers around trans individuals who work in social care, and the generations that don't pardon me, understand trans identity, and we're trying to explain to them, no, this is a woman looking after you. No, it's not. It's a man in a wig. No, it's not. This is a woman looking after you, and you've got to respect that, and you've got to be able to come along with that. So we are doing well. There's just so much that needs to be done, whilst taking into account making sure that everything is holistically comfortable for people to come and move in with us. And like I said, that culture needs to be there. If they can't see themselves reflected in the culture, they'll never be comfortable.
It's such a difficult conversation to have, and one that has to be done with so much delicacy. And I can kind of speak as a trans woman who has a slight expertise in trans legislation or trans-related legislation. The Equality Act is there to protect trans and non-binary people against many forms of discrimination. There is a clause within the Equality Act that allows the separation of single-sex services when there is for legitimate means and proportional aims. So the idea here is that if there is an absolutely valid reason why a trans person could not provide or access that service, and they are not ousted completely from it, and there are other avenues in place for them, then it is fine to do so. Those services are, or that clause is almost exclusively there to protect survivors of domestic violence, and absolutely has a place there. And I will continue to advocate for that, because there are legitimate reasons why some people could not be cared for by somebody that they perceive as a man, rightly or wrongly, as to whether that perception is morally viable. It is not my responsibility, and not within the kind of scopes of my life to decide, actually, you have to not be triggered by this. That's not within my purview. Having said that, would I extend that to people who just have bigotry? Absolutely not. Unfortunately, if somebody doesn't want to use a service, they have every right to refuse access to that service, but they do not have the right to pick and choose based on bigotry that doesn't belong in today's day and age. That is the bottom line of that, unfortunately. If people haven't gotten with the program in 2022, then they're going to get left behind, unfortunately. As callous and as cold as it is for me to say it sometimes, that is on them, and they will have to live with those decisions. But it is a difficult conversation to have. You are absolutely right.
It would be interesting to see what a regulator's kind of perspective on that would be as well, if family complained, or the individual complained, but wasn't necessarily quite as clear about the reasons for. It would be really quite interesting, wouldn't it, because I suspect that might be quite a difficult conversation with your regulator, and a very long one.
Yeah, absolutely.
This wasn't recorded, Michelle, the things I would say.
But you're also right, Adam, about advocacy and about kind of what happens when you lose capacity to advocate for yourself. And unfortunately, one of the things that we see sometimes is older LGBTQ+ people who've gone into care, who've lost capacity to advocate for themselves. Family members sometimes who had separated themselves from that person, decades ago, sometimes coming back in and trying to make decisions about that person's life, telling carers how that person should dress, the kind of people that they should be seeing or not allowed to see, moving a partner out of their life because they are unsupportive. And so as carers, it's part of your responsibility to make an assessment as to the best interests of the patient, or of the client, or the person you're providing care to. And it can be a difficult and grueling conversation when you don't know those kind of answers, and there are no right answers to that, because everybody will have a different side to it. And one thing that we see quite regularly, and kind of difficult conversations on how to care for people is when it comes to dementia care specifically. And how do you provide LGBTQ+ affirmative care to somebody who is living with dementia, whatever stage of dementia that person is in, and bearing in mind all of the stuff that we've spoken about history, about mistrust of authority. All of that can add to the distress that somebody feels if they are living with dementia at that point. So again, lots of difficult conversations. Jade, do you have any kind of specific needs that you think might be relevant to what we're talking about?
Nothing that hasn't already been said, to be fair. I've put a few comments in the chat, particularly around talking with people of all ages, having those supportive and open conversations. I've been having those with my daughter because she said to me one day, "Mummy, when I get older, I'm going to get married." And I said, "Oh, that's lovely. Who are you going to marry?" And she said, "I don't know, it might be a boy or it might be a girl. Is that okay?" I said, "Of course, you can marry whoever you want to." And I went and I started to look for books about different types of families, relationships, that was a level for a child. And we have these board books. I've got a few of them next to me actually that we read through, and she talks about and said, well, that family's got 2 daddies, and that family's got a mummy and a daddy, that family's got grandparents, that family's got a mummy and another mummy, and you know, that family's only got 1 parent. And we have those conversations now at such a young age, and I think that's really important, particularly if we're going to be so inclusive of everybody. People are people. I don't really agree with the labeling of people, but for some they do need it, and then people themselves may feel that they have that label because they need it as part of their identity to say, this is who I am. I'm all for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, welcome, Rachel. Hi. You absolutely, and I think children and young children especially are free in a way that is kind of quite unique, that they haven't, at least up to a certain age, they don't have necessarily those preconceived notions of what is right, quote unquote, and what is wrong, quote unquote. And so the more freedom that we are able to afford them in making choices and exploring, the happier they're going to be. And I think we need to remember that when we think about caring for anybody. It's giving people freedom to choose the life that makes them happiest, or at the very least to choose the avenues that are going to result in the best care for them. And whether that is kind of, you know, choosing to be out and be proud and use labels and identify yourself however you like, or choosing to be quite a little bit more reserved about that and not be as loud, but still be happy in yourself. I think the more we can do of that, the absolute better. Rachel, we're just talking about some specific needs that older LGBTQ plus people might have when going into care environments. Are there any examples that you can think of maybe about some specific needs that people might have?
Yeah, I just was that a question geared at me? Sorry, I was. Yeah, but yes, my only experience in care homes was that the sort of magazines that, you know, people feeling comfortable to read what matters to them. So if there was a particular magazine that is not mainstream in terms of, you know, what you normally find in places, that was really important to make it clear that whatever you feel comfortable, and you should be able to read whatever you want, and it shouldn't be hidden every time somebody comes into a room. And that's the sort of thing. The conversation we have with staff is that, you know, this is their home, this is their individual identity. We shouldn't be, you know, making them feel uncomfortable with what they have in their rooms. So that was something that I came across a few times, which I think people forget, that, you know, this is their room, this is their home, this is their. So just a point to share, that's all.
No, you're absolutely right. Allowing people to create the environment around them that they feel comfortable in without worrying they have to hide things. You know, thinking about pictures of their partners, past partners, current partners, whatever that might be, without having to answer really probing questions from people who might not be supportive.
Yeah.
You know, clothing, decoration, magazines, as you said, that people might want to read. Some of these might be indicators of part of their identity, but they also might not be. Somebody might just enjoy having hobbies that are slightly different, or you know, different to kind of mainstream norms, or wearing clothing that are slightly different, and that's absolutely fine as well. It's about giving that choice, absolutely.
Yeah.
Any others from any other kind of specific needs that anybody else can think of?
I came in a bit late, so I haven't actually seen what. So I'm going to have to see the recording later, but I probably have a question for you later, because I had to be out in another meeting. So apology for that, but it sounds like I may have questions later for you. So thank you very much for sharing.
That is absolutely fine, no problem. The last one of these needs that I want to have a brief chat about, because I know we've only got a couple of minutes left, is that need for community. is that need for people around to be around them or to be around people that are like them. So it's worth thinking about how organizations like Opening Doors or organizations that are local to you can support with those needs, whether that's community groups, whether it's befriending, whether it's going to Pride. There's so many different elements out there that can help bring people together. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen for the last slide to do the summary, and then we'll have a couple of minutes for questions at the end. So, to summarize, older LGBTQ plus people have lived very different lives, or may have lived very different lives from their heterosexual or cisgender counterparts, often involving prison sentences, aversion therapy, and media humiliation. Much has changed over the last 70 years, but there is still a long way to go when it comes to social attitudes and legislation. Our communities have often faced specific, often have specific care needs that require accommodation. Care staff should endeavour to be open to these wherever possible, and we should always attempt to tackle homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia in order to create spaces where everyone feels comfortable to belong. Thank you all so much for attending today's training. I hope you've not minded the kind of slightly improvised element of it, where we've been a lot more conversation than we might otherwise would be. If you would like some more information on training or our quality standard, or you just want to get in touch with us, please do email us at training@openingdoors.lgbt, or our social media handles are down there. But otherwise, thank you very, very much for attending, and I'm happy to spend this final minute answering any questions that anybody has.
Hand on heart, fantastic. I thought that was really, really good. It was refreshing to have an open conversation about it. I think, this sort of approach to understanding and training, as well as the future, we don't know how to rely on slides and have that cut off with an audience. If we want to educate and convert and get people on our side, we need to involve them in the conversation. I just dropped a snarky comment in the chat, just mentioning the fact that allyship and corporate self-interest are getting harder to differentiate nowadays. So look at us, we've changed our logo to include the rainbow for this month, and actually, where's your annual support? Where's your day in, day out support? Where's your internal workforce support? So as much as we like allyship, we've got to be able to differentiate to what is real allyship and support and what is like I say, self-interest. Well, thank you so much, Emma. This has been incredible.
No, thank you for coming on, but you're so right, and kind of the example that springs to my mind, we're recording this, so I won't name them directly, a service by which you are able to pay somebody money without using a bank account, changing their logo to the Pride colours, but simultaneously refusing to allow trans people to update their names on the system without creating a new account. Right? It's that performative pat on the back, well done us, we're so inclusive, without enacting any meaningful change.
I shouldn't laugh, but it's just the irony, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Honestly.
Rachel,
you've inspired me to go and learn more about Opening Doors.
Excellent.
I've got their website up at the moment. I see they're looking for trustees. I may just apply. I think it's honestly, I think it's something that's fresh. It's new. It needs to happen, and the conversations you're having are true and honest. And if we can start that change now, I know the Institute are fully behind supporting the diversity and inclusion of all of our people. The only thing I would say is, and I will probably watch Heartstopper myself, is I'm praying for the day that we get true inclusivity. So we get people of colour and disabilities of the LGBT community being represented. We get true trans people being represented, and we stop having straight actors play gay characters or LGBT queer characters, and then being patted on the back going, "Oh, you've taken a brave role there." I think it's patronising our community. But yes, Doctor Who. I can't even tell you how excited I am about Doctor Who. We've got our first Black openly gay Doctor, and our trans assistant is going to be incredible. This is like a moment for the younger generations now.
Having grown up watching Doctor Who from 2005, stopped watching around Peter Capaldi's time, this is what will get me back into it. I love Ncuti Gatwa. I absolutely loved him in Sex Education, and I'm so excited for a trans companion. I'm very, very excited for that.
It's really good. Yeah.
Rachel, did you have a quick question before we close up?
No, I just thinking some of the things that I'm mindful of is that a lot of people feel uncomfortable of making a mistake to say the wrong thing, And I sometimes think that creates a barrier. I have three children, 2 of them are adults and one teenager, and I notice I'm always being told, oh no, that's not the correct thing to say. And I was like, that makes it awkward, because how are we going to learn if you're constantly being told, oh no, you can't say that? So I think we need to have some sort of a better way of encouraging people to explore and to be open about it. And my worry is this cancel culture makes people really uncomfortable at exploring sexuality, identity, all of that, because it's almost becomes a taboo just because of this fear element. If you follow what I'm saying?
I think there is that lack of confidence, isn't there, sometimes when engaging with LGBTQ plus issues generally. If I had another 40 minutes, I would talk for hours about cancel culture and how that maybe isn't always what's happening and what's going on. But I think having training like this with your organization, whether it's with us or not, we would always like it to be us, but it doesn't matter, helps you to have those conversations in a learning environment where you're not going to be shut down by anybody, where you're kind of being sat down with myself or with anybody else whose kind of professional job it is to work with the language you currently have, and upskill you in whatever it is you need to know.
I think we could talk about, thank you. I think we could talk about this for ages. We're running slightly over because we've got Josephine's up next. However, what I will say, and Josephine, please keep your ears open for this one as well, let's have a discussion at the IHSCM around LGBTQIA support, diversity, inclusion, microaggressions, heteronormatives, getting things wrong. You know, let's normalize getting things wrong. And then let's normalize accepting people get things wrong, forgive them and support them to learn from it. Because you're right, cancel culture can be a difficult scenario, but we need to broach the idea that constantly getting things wrong lends us into microaggressions and, into abusive territories. But let's have some sort of open conversation. We'll do a round table or something, I think, at the IHSCM and have a really sort of open discussion about it, safe space. Let's do it, I think. So thank you so much, Emma, again.